And for the next minute, I want you to think of the 3 most important things about that topic, okay? And I'm going to time you, and then you are going to have 30 seconds to explain it to each other, all right? So your minute to think about this very complicated thing starts right now, okay? You don't have to explain it to each other yet, just think about it. And then I'll tell you when it's time to explain it, yeah. Oh, that's totally good too. Yep, so choose a topic that you know a lot about. The more complicated, the better. The more boring, the better. And then I want you to think of the 3 most important takeaways from that topic that you would want someone to understand. And I was talking to my husband about this, and I was like, what if I just used, why should you be like a political science major? What are 3 reasons that you should be a political science major? Something like that. Or it could be more complicated than that. Mine would be affordable housing. I would consider myself fairly knowledgeable about affordable housing in the state of Utah. Could be your last research paper. So think about something kind of complicated that you know a lot about, and then the 3 most important things about that. We'll start our minute over. All right, that's time for our brainstorming session. Now, between the people who are going to be your partners, choose between the 2 or 3 of you which is going to go first. Okay? Have we all come to a conclusion? Okay. I'm going to say go, and I'm going to say stop. Okay, so for this first person, go ahead and start. All right, that's time. 30 seconds. Okay, all right, so take a breath. Now it's the next person's turn. Okay, so the second, how many of you have a group of 3? Okay, enough. All right, okay. So the second person, when I say go, you get 30 seconds. All right, go ahead and start. Okay, that's 30 seconds. Go ahead and stop. All right, so the last person in these groups of 3, get ready to start. If you only had a group of 2, you can just kind of listen to the chaos around you. Okay, so this last person, go ahead and start. You have 30 seconds. Okay, that's time for the very last person. That's 30 seconds. All right. Okay, raise your hand if you got through all 3 of your things. Oh, excellent. Okay. Who thinks they did like an amazing job? Oh, come on. Come on. Don't sell yourself short. Was it harder than you thought it was going to be, considering that you're an expert? Okay, if you were, now I'm going to ask this question. This is all a ploy, by the way, so that I could catch my breath before I started speaking. This means nothing. I'm just kidding. It means nothing. No, so think about the people who were talking to you. Do you feel like you have a grasp on what they were an expert in? Do you you're saying, yeah? Yeah? Okay, good. That says a lot about the people who weren't very confident that they had done a very good job. Either that or you're very kind to your classmates. Okay, so I had you do this exercise because I don't know if you knew this, but academic writing doesn't really lend itself to brevity, right? And I'm a lobbyist. And one of the skills that I wish that I had learned when I was at BYU was how to condense something that I was considered an expert in, into something very simple, into 3 points. And I chose 30 seconds, not for some arbitrary rule because it's easy to keep track of or anything like that, but because when I am on Capitol Hill and I'm having conversations with legislators, and like Ryan mentioned, I work for the Utah Association of Realtors. So the topics that I spend the most time talking about are private property rights, affordable housing, property taxes, water rights, all of those kinds of things. But right now in particular, it's affordable housing. So I get about 15 to 30 seconds when I catch a legislator. And I'm catching them sometimes in an elevator, sometimes it's before they walk into a committee hearing, sometimes it's in the parking lot, very occasionally it is in the bathroom. There are not very many women, but every once in a while I can corner somebody in the bathroom and talk about affordable housing. But I only get about 30 seconds to make my pitch, depending on what I'm talking about. And there are definitely times where I meet for longer and I try to explain, and I really try to persuade in a longer form type of meeting or situation or negotiation, that type of thing. But when I have a bill up, and it's up for a vote that afternoon, and I need a majority of the 75 legislators, I need more than 38 of them to vote yes, I'm trying to catch them wherever I can get them. And usually it's about a fairly complicated piece of legislation. And sometimes it falls along partisan lines, sometimes it doesn't. But because we have a citizen legislature in Utah, which means that they only work from January to March, right? They're part-time. They get paid, I think, like $22,000 a year, something like that. They all have day jobs. And the truth would have you believe that, like, the real estate industry runs Utah, but most of them don't sell houses for a living. Sometimes they develop land. Sometimes, many times they're lawyers. They're teachers, they're doctors, they're all sorts of things. But they're very rarely experts in affordable housing. And so I'm trying to take something that I have spent years studying, and a bill that we've spent close to 10 months drafting, and give it to them in 30 seconds. And that is, interestingly enough, the easy part of that. Okay? So very briefly, I'm going to tell you how I got to the job that I'm in right now, in case lobbying is interesting to you. I graduated from BYU with a degree in political science, but I also got a minor in communications, in PR specifically, and I got a lot of my marketable skills from that, but a lot of my knowledge about how the government works and policy and things like that from my poli-sci degree. I'm not a numbers person, which is blasphemous to half the political science, more than half the political science department at BYU. Data was never my strong suit. It was always people and relationships and words. And so that's kind of how I got into lobbying in the first place. My first job was at the Utah House of Representatives. I was the deputy press secretary for Becky Lockhart, who was the first speaker of the House. And that was like 10 years ago when they had really small staffs. And so I had a lot of responsibility. It was also in the middle of a recession. They really couldn't afford to hire very many people, which was both good and bad for me. But that was my first job out of college. And I got that by just bothering a guest speaker that came to my media and American politics class about an internship. And she connected me. And then after that, I went and lobbied for the Charter School Association. But it was kind of a twofer. I was also their communications director because they were a small nonprofit and they needed somebody who could do both. And then after that, I went to work for World Trade Center Utah as the government affairs liaison for the legislature, and I took a group of senators and representatives to China for a trade mission. And then I got a job at the Utah Association of Realtors. And I will say that I didn't really apply for any of those jobs. I badgered my way into them, or I knew somebody who knew somebody that was hiring, and that's kind of how I heard about them. But I don't think I ever got on LinkedIn or Indeed or filled out an application. And that's because, at least in lobbying, it's become a very relationship-oriented field, and so it is a lot about who you know. And luckily, people who come and guest lecture, they count as people that you know if you email them and you bother them like I did, and I'm going to encourage you to do at the end. So how many of you listened to the podcast that I recommended? Okay, has nothing to do with condensing things into a simple format, but has everything to do about listening. So for those of you who weren't able to listen to it, I'm just going to describe it very briefly. Malcolm Gladwell is a renowned author. He wrote Outliers, that thing about 10,000 hours and being an expert and that kind of thing. He also has a podcast called Revisionist History, which is the one that I suggested that you listen to, but he started at the Washington Post as a journalist, and then he's written several novels. He could be considered, I think, an expert on people and relationships and storytelling in particular. He was invited to a debate series in Canada, and he did a terrible, terrible job. Awful. He just got completely trounced. And the situation was he was defending the mainstream media. And after his really, really abysmal campaign performance or debate performance, he called his mom and then he called his friend who's a debate coach at a charter school in New York and was like, "What did I do wrong?" And he was like, "Well, how about you come to New York and I tell you all of the things that you did wrong?" And he was like, "Oh, all right, I'll go." And at the end, he asks, "Did I do anything right?" And they were essentially like, "No, you didn't." And they had high school students tell him, "No, you didn't do anything correctly." And the main takeaway, I think, from this podcast, and feel free to disagree, is that he was so caught up in making sure that he was making the point that he wanted to make that he forgot that he was supposed to be persuading an audience, that the group of people there were supposed to be persuaded into thinking that the mainstream media was something that could be trusted. And instead, he just essentially talked down to anybody who was skeptical at all of the mainstream media. And as a result of that, he didn't know his audience, didn't understand his audience, and he did really, really poorly. He didn't persuade anybody. So what I mean about the simplification part of this being the easy part is that affordable housing can be a really complicated thing, but I can distill it into 3 main talking points. Usually I can say, look, Utah has an affordable housing shortage. This happened because after the recession in 2008, home builders went out of business, existing home builders got gun shy, and we just didn't build at a rate that people were moving to Utah. So we don't have enough houses for all the people who moved here for jobs. And we have about a 35,000 home deficit. And that's not apartments, that's like homes, people who want to buy. And that one of the things that is exacerbating that problem is for sure interest rates. Interest rates have gone up. They made it really hard for people to make these monthly payments, so they can't get into a house. Or they make it really hard for people to save, and so they can't get into a house. But one of the main issues is that cities are not zoning for small lot, single family homes. They're just not. They don't want them, and they don't want them for a variety of reasons. And so my argument to the state legislature is, we've let the cities try, and they have failed over and over again, and now it's time for you to step in and say, enough. The whole state suffers when you refuse to zone for small lot, single family homes. The economy suffers, the people who live here and work here suffer, children suffer for all sorts of education outcome reasons. You need to do something about it. Now, there are lots of legislators at the Hill, and there are lots of Republicans, and it would be really easy to think that Republicans, they all think the same way about something. But because they're a supermajority state, I would actually say that they're pretty much more similar to the coalitions that you see in Germany that are built around certain topics, because you have a libertarian faction of Republicans, you have a QAnon faction of Republicans, whether I hope that they go away or stay, like they're there. You have a group of Republicans who are actually in swing seats, who have a really hard time, who have a Democratic challenger that has a shot. And then you have Republicans who are very rural, and they have a very different idea about housing. And all of those people, I can give my talking points to them, but it's not going to persuade them. So I have to take the thing that I consider myself an expert in, and it's me being pretty arrogant. There are definitely people who are more of an expert in affordable housing than me, but unfortunately for the realtors, I'm who they pay. But I can give them my arguments for why they need to do something about it. But those arguments are going to resonate differently with different people. So for people who are more local control or libertarian inclined, I come at it from a private property rights perspective. If they're like, you know what, I hear what you're saying, I think it's a problem, but I believe in local control, then my argument would be, local control is still government, and government can still overreach. And the thing that is the most local about private property rights is the homeowner and the land that they own, or the land that they would like to develop. And when you have zoning and things like that, it puts an artificial cap on the market. It's not a free market. So you can say, I think the market will correct it, I think it will take care of itself in time, or I believe in local control. But the reality is that local control is still government, and it still meddles in a free market, and it still makes the housing market inflated, and it still contributes to the problem, right? So that's like one section of people. There's another section of Republicans who will say, I want completely walkable cities. Like I don't want homes anymore. I just want apartments and townhomes, okay? And those are things that exist. And so for them, my argument would be, we actually have a lot of townhome units. We have a lot of apartment units, and they serve their purpose. But there are people who are in townhomes and who are in apartments who have 2, 3, 4 children who are looking for something just a little bit bigger. And that thing is not available to them. And it's not available to them, not because of apartments and townhomes, but because we're zoning for McMansions. Have you guys been to Alpine lately? Okay. There are some cities that have lot mandatory minimums where they say, you're not allowed to develop anything on smaller than an acre of a lot. Do you know how big of an acre is? It's wildly large to me, at least. And I grew up on I think my parents lived on about a quarter of an acre, and that was pretty big in Las Vegas. Right now, my house sits on 0.14 of an acre. My husband's nodding. He's like, yeah, you got it right. Which I think is still pretty big. I have a yard. I have a 3-car garage. It's a pretty decent sized house. But there are cities who are like, no, that invites crime. That invites the wrong type of person. I don't want a lot that small. And so then I have to have a conversation about why people want a lot that small and why it doesn't invite crime. So basically what I'm getting at is that for as many different people as there are at the legislature, there are that many different opinions about what's important to them. and what arguments are going to resonate with them. And so if you want to be a lobbyist, and this is the caveat, but this is kind of what drew me to this job in the first place, is that I like to learn about different things, a lot of different things, and I like to do deep dives about a lot of different things. And I actually really like to distill that information and give it to people in a simplified format. I think that it's a really good exercise in terms of whether or not you can consider yourself an expert, whether or not you can prove that you know something backwards and forwards. But the really difficult part, and the reason that they say that lobbying is a relationship business, is because I have to tailor my argument to every single person that I talk to. And they have different political beliefs. And it can be hard to know what those are if you don't listen. And so the Malcolm Gladwell podcast is about listening. And I'm talking to you about it in terms of a professional context. I listen to these people when they talk about their kids. I listen to them when they talk at campaign events. I read what they say to reporters. I listen when they give public testimony in committee or on the floor. I listen to them. And then I try to file away what I think is important to them, their value system, whether or not that is the free market, or it is making sure that kids have a stable place to live, or if it is complete anarchy and the ability to build whatever you want, wherever you want, or if it is green development and making sure that the things that we build are energy conscious, or if it's water conservation. Every single part of that, I try to listen and I try to file it away. And that is how you go legislator to legislator and try to make your argument. Sometimes I make it easy for you and they group up and I can say, hey, these 10 people, this is what's going to resonate with them. The rural caucus makes it a little bit easier because they have very similar constituencies. But that's what I do, issue by issue, bill by bill. And I really like it, but it's not for everybody. The other reason that I think it's useful to listen to this Malcolm Gladwell podcast, and if you haven't listened to it and you're curious about it, I would listen to it on double speed. He talks slow enough. But just when you're walking back to your apartment or something, he talks about how he forgot that he was supposed to be persuading someone. And how many of you are like frustrated by politics and talking about politics with your friends and family? Like, right, I'm endlessly frustrated by this. I'm endlessly frustrated by my Facebook page, my like Vineyard City Facebook page. The politics on there, absolutely not. I want nothing to do with it. But I think this will help you personally as well, because there are so many times where I look at my husband and I'm like, I cannot believe that these people think this. And he'll look at me and go, really? You can't believe it? And that's something that Malcolm Gladwell forgot during his debate performance, and it's something that I have forgotten personally on occasion and professionally on occasion. And it's that I need to have empathy for the person that I'm trying to persuade, or they're not going to want to be persuaded by me. There is no person on this planet who is going to want me to have a conversation with them where I start it by saying, hey, I have no idea why you would believe this, because frankly it's stupid, but here's why you're wrong. Nobody wants that. Nobody wants to be talked to that way. Sometimes they talk to each other on Facebook that way, but I would argue that it's like purely performative. Like, people really aren't trying to persuade. They're trying to kind of show whoever sees them on Facebook, their friends, where exactly they stand. But that part of it's not persuasive. It's not persuasive to my parents or my siblings or my neighbors or the legislators that I'm trying to help. And so I think that if you can practice empathy and you can listen to the people around you and form your arguments based on that it will serve you better personally. I think you will be less upset. I think you will hate the people around you a little less because you will understand where they're trying to come from. And I forget this personally all the time, but I'm going to give you an example of where I forgot it professionally and how I kind of had to recalibrate. So we've done so many studies about affordable housing, and one of the things that we found after we did a poll was that people in Utah, once they graduate from college and they get married and they want to live here, there's nowhere for them to live and there's nowhere for them that they can like afford to live. And that's just to rent. And once they get into an apartment or a house to rent, there's definitely no hope for them to save for a down payment because the rent is super high. And now interest rates are really, really high. And so we were talking and brainstorming and we were like, well, people should care about this. People will care about this. There's nowhere for their kids to go. And people really want their kids to live near them. So we should do a campaign about this. Like, we should let people know, because older people who are already in their homes, it's really hard to persuade them that you need to build more homes. They have theirs, they're fine, they like it, it's hard to convince them that there's a problem. And so one of the ways that we thought we were going to do this was by telling them, there's nowhere for your kids to live. This is really important. If you don't do something about this, they're going to have to move away. You're going to hate that because your grandkids are going to move away. And so we did like a year-long campaign about this. There were TV spots and radio spots and Facebook advertisements and Instagram videos and several op-eds, and we did interviews in KSL and the Deseret News, and we talked about this at the legislature nonstop. And then the next year we weren't seeing any movement. P.S. Shocker. And the next year we did another poll, and we asked them to rank how important it was that their kids found a place to live near them. You guys, it was so low. It was so low. They don't care. And we were convinced. We were like, they want their kids to live by them. They always say that they want their kids to live by them. This is the angle that we should take. And I assumed, of course they want their kids to live by them. They don't care. They don't care about that at all. They care about traffic. They care about home value. And that's about it. And so we had to seriously redirect the public-facing campaign that we had because we had just assumed, of course they're going to care where their kids live. They don't. And the thing is, if I had thought for 2 seconds about my parents, they don't care where I live. As long as I'm not their problem anymore, they do not care. Maybe if we had done a campaign that was like, hey, do you want your kid out of your basement? Maybe that would have like resonated a little bit more. But this whole like when they're married and they're not going to have anywhere to live, they didn't really mind that they had to figure it out. Because in their mind, they're like, well, I figured it out. They're going to have to figure it out. That's fine. So the thing that did scare them, in case you were curious about what does move that older generation in terms of affordable housing, is that there are people in their homes right now who can sell the home that they raised their kids in and still not afford to buy a home to live out their retirement in, because that's how out of control housing prices have got. So they have an older home, let's say like in Orem, it's like 2 or 3 bedrooms. They'd like to downsize to a townhome of a sort. So that house in Orem will sell for maybe $300,000 or $400,000 because of its age and because of the size, and usually because of location as well. And a lot of these places haven't been updated in a really long time. The townhomes in Vineyard and the townhomes in Orem, they sell for about $450,000 to $500,000. So these people in their retirement would have to sell their home and then take out a loan to buy a smaller house or to buy a comparable sized home. And they really care about that because that's expensive for them. And so that's kind of how we figured out what will be persuasive to them. But it took some focus groups where we asked people who were not our age, what do you care about? And it took listening to that and then building a campaign around that instead of running with what we thought was like an amazing idea, what we thought would for sure resonate with people. So that's why I had to do that exercise. It wasn't just so that I could catch my breath. How many of you think that lobbying sounds like kind of an appealing profession? Just a few? Okay, how many of you feel like you know what lobbying is for sure? Okay. There are a few different ways that you can lobby, and I want to go through them briefly. So I work for an association, which means that I have dues-paying members. They pay a certain amount every year to be considered a realtor. For that cost, they get a bunch of different services. We have a legal hotline, we have continuing education credit that they can qualify for, and one of the things that they get also is advocacy, which means that they pay me to track the issues that are important to them and important to real estate and report back and lobby. So there are associations like the Manufacturing Association, there are associations of accountants, there's so many. The bar kind of functions this way for lawyers. And that's one way to lobby for an organization. It's kind of in-house, but it's not for a business, it's for people. So it's a little bit of a hybrid there. You can do in-house lobbying for something like Clyde or Larry H. Miller or the Jazz. They have an in-house lobbyist, believe it or not. And then they pay you to pay attention to issues that would affect that business and that business alone. And you would lobby purely based on that. And then there are nonprofit organizations that pay for people to lobby on their behalf. United Way of Utah is one of them. They do a lot of really good work. The Charter School Association that I worked for was a nonprofit association. The Utah Education Association is a nonprofit association, and they have a lobbyist. And then there are contract lobbyists, and those lobbyists are usually have a pretty big book of business to have made it a career. But for companies that can't afford to bring somebody in-house and pay them like a full salary, they'll have monthly retainers or they'll pay them a certain amount for the session. And for that session alone, that lobbyist will pay attention to the issues that might impact that company. And usually those contract lobbyists have many, many different issues that they're working on, many different companies that they're working on. Occasionally you'll get contract lobbyists that specialize in certain things. Like there are a couple lobbyists I know that do a ton of insurance and medical kind of appropriations asks and things like that. They're a little bit different, but one of the reasons that contract lobbying is appealing to me, and I don't do it exactly, but is that you get to learn a lot about a lot of different topics, and that's kind of neat. And then you follow them for that session, and hopefully you do a good enough job that they want you back the following session. In other states and in Congress, lobbying rules can be very lax. In Utah, they are very strict. So there are sometimes these ideas that we like wine and dine lobbyists and we like take them on vacation. First, I cannot think of anything worse than going on vacation with legislators. That sounds awful to me. I'm so glad I'm not legally allowed to do that. I have a per diem that I'm allowed essentially to spend on their food for the day, and it's about $38. So I can take them to Cafe Rio and they can get a dessert and a drink, but anywhere more expensive than that, and we're gonna kind of get into some trouble. There's a gift limit. I can't buy them anything that's worth more than $10, which is good because I don't want to buy them gifts. I'm pretty happy about that. And then we have really strict reporting requirements. So if I can technically go over that without getting into trouble, but I have to report it. They have to report it. So I like to keep it under the limit. We have to report every time that we give them money for a campaign, every time that we invite them somewhere, that kind of thing. So I would say that Utah is very transparent and they're very strict about their lobbying laws domestically. Internationally, Utah has some pretty lax lobbying laws. And there are a couple reasons for that, but I won't get into them like here. But so if you're a foreign entity lobbying in Utah, you have fewer rules than I do, which is kind of funny and weird. And something we're working on changing, but it's slow going. So yeah, there's very little that I can do in terms of bribery or gift giving, vacations. We can't, darn it, I'm so bummed. No, I like it that way because that means that the lobbyists in Utah have to trade on information and trust. And that's really important to me and to the legislators, because if I burn a legislator by giving them half-true information, that sticks with me. And they remember that about me, and they're less likely to trust me in the future. So I'm incentivized because I can't just pay for them to go to Cancun and forget that time that I lied to them. I'm incentivized to tell the truth. I'm incentivized to provide them with the best information possible. Don't get me wrong, I'm definitely going to try and persuade them that my point of view is the better point of view. But it doesn't come with money, it doesn't come with favors or vacations or cooked data. So that's why I feel comfortable being a lobbyist. I don't know that I would feel that comfortable being a lobbyist federally. It sounds gross. I don't want to go on vacation with congressmen and senators. They don't seem like, frankly, a very good time. But that's a little bit about lobbying in Utah. Do you have any questions for me about that? Yeah. Oh, yeah. How big is your lot? No, I'm just kidding. I'm not going to ask that. Yeah.
What would you change about Alpine?
What would I change?
Yeah, because it is, like, there are no apartments. It's mainly single-family homes, but it is definitely larger single-family homes in most of it.
Yeah, so that's a really good question. And it is something that we talk about a lot in terms of, the phrase that we use is smart growth. And the idea for a healthy city is that you have a strong tax base and you have a place for someone to live in every phase of their life. And that's good for your local economy, because if there's not a place for someone who works at the Chick-fil-A to live within your city, it means they're commuting from outside of your city to that Chick-fil-A, or they're not working at the Chick-fil-A at all. So with Alpine in particular, Alpine doesn't have a very good sales tax base or industrial tax base, which means just that kind of that they wanted it to be very like single family oriented, but because of that, there's not really a downtown. There's not a place for you to go to Ulta or like Target or anywhere like that. And that tax revenue is important because it can help offset some of the property tax revenue that you lose by having smaller lots. And So that's one thing I would change. I would have, back in the day that they were planning Alpine, tried to help them have a better understanding of how much commercial, retail, housing, industrial, what kind of ratio that is for like a healthy city and a healthy economy, and then what kind of homes you need in order to sustain that as well. So I live in Vineyard, not because I think it's like, I mean, I moved there and then kind of realized that they had done a pretty good job planning. But the way that they've built out Vineyard is they have built a lot of their commercial and industrial close to the freeway. And then close to that commercial industrial is their density. So that's where a lot of their apartments are. And that is where a lot of their smaller townhomes are. And then the further you get from the freeway, the larger the lots get. And so you'll get into some standalone single-family homes on small lots like mine. You have some that get a little bit larger, like 0.24 of an acre. And then right by the lake, people pay a premium to be really close to the mosquitoes, and they have somewhat larger lots, and they build custom homes over there. We also have like a 55-plus senior kind of neighborhood that they're like quad homes. So they're not quite as dense as like townhomes, but they all kind of share a courtyard, and their HOA takes care of all of their lawn care and whatnot because they're all retired. Yeah.
What's your take on? Thank you. What's your take on the Utah City development thing that just passed? I think earlier this week.
Yeah. So the Utah City development has been in preparation and planning for a number of years, probably closer to 8 or 9 years, when Geneva Steel decided to shut down and redevelop everything. That's when they started working on that plan. And so they've been talking about Utah City, not that it was named that specifically, and I still think it's kind of a dumb name. It's a really dumb name. It's like in Vineyard, but it's called Utah City. It makes absolutely no sense. But it has been part of city council meetings for 7 or 8 years. So they've been talking about it and the zoning around it for a really long time. So my neighbors that complain, like, where this came out of nowhere, I didn't hear about this. They've swept this under the rug. They're keeping this from me. They've been talking about it for a really, really long time. But if you haven't moved here until after it had been approved and zoned, you maybe wouldn't have known that. The thing that worries me about Utah City is that I really hope that they have the roads to get to Utah City, because right now, like, Vineyard doesn't have its own exit off the freeway. It shares Orem Center and 800 North, and those are pretty much the only two. And right now, Orem Center is down to 1 lane because they're doing a water project, and it's ruined everyone's life. Like, you can't not get off the freeway right there. And every time that I try to go down Center and I remember, I hate myself for not just going to 800 or University Parkway because it adds like 20 minutes. So that's the kind of thing that makes me nervous. And when people talk about development and cities talk about development and smart growth, I try to make the argument that, like, if you develop poorly, people aren't going to be inclined to develop again. So when you approve, Provo has done this a few times, when you approve a lot of development without enough parking and you make people really angry because there's nowhere to park, they're a lot less likely to approve development for you in the future. You have to keep that in mind. So good development begets good development. Bad development can almost assure that a city doesn't want to invite you to develop any of their open land. So I really hope that Utah City has another road, another exit. Hopefully, maybe they take 400 North in Orem and they kind of beef that up and they have another overpass over the railroad tracks. That would be my hope. But I mean, the Huntsman Cancer Institute is coming. That's really, really cool. They're going to have a campus out in Utah City. There's going to be a lot of mixed-use development, so like shops on the bottom, apartments on top. I think that's a really cool way to add density, but also keep a community feel. So I'm pretty excited about it. A lot of my neighbors are nervous. I don't think it'll invite a lot of crime. It will invite traffic, though, if they don't plan for it right. So I hope that that's something that that's why I'm going to keep an eye on in city council meetings and whatnot. Yeah.
So kind of bouncing a little bit back to the last question, but still talking about planning smart, is there a way that as Utah moves forward and is building communities a little bit more strategically for the future, that it could still keep some of the areas that maybe people prefer to live in a place where it's just completely tucked away, or they're okay with not having a Target in Alpine or whatever.
Yeah.
And how would that work if it's coming from state laws that are going to be making the changes?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. And it's one that I think does not have an easy answer, because my answer would be private property rights. essentially. That there are people who do want to live in a place that don't have a target, and that's totally fine. But there are also farmers who want to sell their land to develop a target, and that is their right as property owners, right? And so that balance of community members having a stake in the conversation and property rights holders having a stake in the conversation, and then the city and the state having a stake in that conversation, it's a tough balance to have. And I think that like in Heber and in Midway, you've seen a lot of heartburn because a lot of people who owned farms sold that land to home developers, and it brought a lot more people or it brought a lot more stores, and there are people who moved to Midway or Heber specifically because they didn't want that, and they're unhappy with it. And it's a really tough situation because I think that if you should be able to find the place that you want to live, and if that is in the middle of nowhere with no target, I hope that you find that. But for me, what's really important is that if you buy a piece of land, you have property rights attached to that land. And that if you have a farm that's been in your family for 40 years and you don't want to run the farm anymore, but that's kind of like your inheritance, it's been your parents' and your grandparents' retirement, that you have the right to sell that. And that someone can't come in and say, hey, we actually want this to stay a farm forever, so you can never sell this land or not farm, right? And that's an extreme example, but those are the kinds of tough discussions that you get into in city council meetings. So it's a hard balance, and that is like why when we're talking to legislators at a state level, we're trying to advocate for like less interference in those decisions from cities and from the state. It sounds counterintuitive. I'm asking the state to ask the cities to do less, but that's essentially what I'm asking them to do, is to interfere less. But you've asked a question that is so hard to answer, and it's so hard to answer for so many people because it's what appeals to your value, right? And like, some people would argue, well, I live on the land next to the farm that wants to sell to the target. Don't I get a say in what goes next to me? Because I own land too, and the property value of that land is going to be impacted, and the infrastructure is going to be impacted. And the answer is yeah, to a certain extent, but finding that balance is what's really hard. So I don't really have a good answer. I'm sorry.
No, thank you.
Oh, yeah, I will not keep you. Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.